Bond is set for the Columbus woman accused of killing her husband on.
He don't never have to question. He don't want to question everybody's loyalty. But what?
Give me my phone, bro. Don't shut
Is set at $750,000.
On the morning of March 25th, 2023, in Columbus, Mississippi, 28-year-old Khadijah Michelle Brown started a Facebook live stream on her page. The viewers who tuned into that stream will probably never forget it. Right there on camera, Khadijah shot and killed her husband, 28-year-old Jeremy Rashad Brown, during an argument inside their own apartment.
Bond is set for the Columbus woman accused of killing her husband on Facebook Live. Khadijah Brown is charged with murder after this Saturday morning shooting at Green Tree Apartments.
In this video, we're breaking down what pushed a young woman to kill her own husband, and why she chose to do it live, in front of an audience, instead of behind closed doors, away from anyone watching. Jeremy Rashad Brown was born June 24, 1994, in Columbus, Mississippi. He grew up in that same city, graduated from Columbus High School, and stayed connected to his hometown his entire life. Jeremy had been a Christian since he was young and was a member of Friendship MB Church, the congregation he belonged to right up until his death. Faith held a steady place in his life. At the time of his death, Jeremy worked as a manager at National Sales of Lease. On his social media profile, he described himself in one short line: a boss at everything I do. That same page showed a man living an active digital life, posting photos, keeping an eye on the response he got, presenting himself to the world in a specific way: successful, confident, put together. To friends and followers, he came across as hardworking and driven, and, importantly for this story, a father of 4: Jeremiah, Zanya, Messiah, and Josiah. Far less is known about Khadijah Michelle Brown's childhood and early years. She was also born in Columbus, Mississippi. By 2023, she was 28, the same age as Jeremy. The one documented detail from her past that shows up anywhere in the public record is a prior domestic violence conviction, dating back well before her husband's murder. What exactly happened in that earlier case, and who was identified as the victim in it, isn't disclosed in the sources. What is known is that this episode existed in her history before her marriage to Jeremy, or at the very start of their life together, meaning violence in this relationship wasn't something that showed up out of nowhere, with no history behind it. Khadijah and Jeremy had been together since their school days. Their relationship stretched on for nearly a decade, long enough for teenage attachment to have grown into something more mature, to have been tested by time, by daily life, by growing up. Over those years, the couple had 4 children together, moved into a shared home at the Green Tree Apartments complex in Columbus, and built a life with its own routines. On March 5th, 2023, 20 days before Jeremy's death, the couple publicly marked their 7th anniversary. Jeremy posted a message to his wife on Facebook: "Happy anniversary to my queen, my friend, my wonderful and marvelous wife, Khadijah M. Brown." Khadijah responded with a post of her own, describing their relationship this way: "Go through our ups and downs and sad and happy times and still remain to be together like always." From the outside, this looked like a happy couple. Their social media pages were full of photos from family celebrations and the kids' birthdays, snapshots that, by all appearances, were taken during good stretches in their relationship. To anyone scrolling through their pages, Khadijah and Jeremy Brown looked exactly like what people mean when they describe a solid family. But behind that image was a very different, far less stable reality.
Lowndes County Sheriff Eddie Hawkins says Brown and her husband, 28-year-old Jeremy Brown, have been arguing most of the night.
Lowndes County Sheriff Eddie Hawkins would later officially confirm that Khadijah and Jeremy had a documented history of domestic violence and that both spouses had been named in those cases. That means the conflict in this household went beyond arguments, and at least twice, once for each of them, if we're counting one case per person, had already escalated to the point of law enforcement getting involved long before the morning of March 25th. Both adults in this household had at different points been on both sides of that equation, accused and in turn victim. That's an unusual symmetry for cases like this, and one that on its own raises real questions about the nature of their conflicts. That raises a question the sources don't answer. How did these two realities, the public declarations of love and the documented history of violence, coexist in this couple's life for 7+ years? One possible answer lies in the basic nature of abusive relationships, where cycles of conflict and reconciliation can repeat for years, and outward signs of affection, sincere or performative, can exist right alongside episodes of violence without cancelling each other out. That's a theory grounded in the general pattern seen in cases like this one, not a claim backed by direct evidence specific to this family, since the details of the earlier domestic violence incidents between Khadijah and Jeremy aren't disclosed in available materials. Just as open is the question of what actually changed in this couple's relationship in the 19 days between the March 5th anniversary and the tragedy on the 25th. Whatever it was, jealousy, exhaustion from raising 4 kids, financial strain, resentment built up over years together, or something else the public record doesn't capture, it must have already been building before March 24th, the day the conflict first spilled out of their private home and onto Facebook in public. On March 24th, 2023, the day before Jeremy's death, Khadijah posted screenshots on her page of Instagram messages between Jeremy and another woman. The post came with a direct public accusation that her husband had been unfaithful. In that same string of posts, Khadijah also accused Jeremy of inappropriate conduct toward what she described as co-workers. This wasn't said in a private conversation or a closed message thread. It went out to her entire audience of followers, the same people who, 3 weeks earlier, had read her post about staying together with Jeremy through every high and low. For a man who publicly presented himself as a boss in everything he did, being accused of cheating in front of hundreds of shared acquaintances could have landed as more than a personal blow. It could have felt like a direct threat to the image Jeremy had spent years building on social media. We can only guess at how he took that post and what happened between the two of them during the rest of that day. The sources don't preserve any details of a private conversation between them, if one even happened before that evening. How typical is this pattern in relationships where both partners have prior domestic violence records? Researchers who study cases like this point out that a cycle of conflict, reconciliation, and public declarations of love often becomes a stable pattern, specifically in couples where violence has already occurred. An incident is followed by a period of remorse and visible affection, which then gives way to tension again. Khadijah and Jeremy's timeline, the anniversary on March 5th, the cheating accusation on the 24th, fits that pattern almost exactly. But the sources don't allow us to confirm this actually was that kind of cycle, rather than something else. We're presenting this as a theory based on the general pattern of cases like this, not as an established fact specific to this family. The second accusation in those same March 24th posts deserves its own attention. The claim about Jeremy's inappropriate conduct toward co-workers. Unlike the infidelity accusation, which was backed by screenshots, this claim isn't detailed anywhere in the public record. It's not known what kind of conduct was alleged, which co-workers were supposedly involved, or whether Khadijah had any evidence beyond her own word. We're leaving that question open. Either way, by the evening of March 24th, 2023, the Brown household was in what can only be described as an open public crisis. Infidelity accusations made in front of shared acquaintances, vague and unresolved complaints about workplace conduct, all layered on top of an existing history of domestic violence that involved both spouses. Before we go any further, if this story has your attention, hit that like button. It tells us stories like this need to be told. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. And drop a comment. What do you think about this case? Now, let's get back into it. Khadijah and Jeremy Brown spent the night of March 24th into the 25th fighting. The conflict took up most of the night and played out in their apartment at 500 Green Tree Drive in the Green Tree Apartments complex. Khadijah's mother was in the apartment at the time, and, according to some accounts, at least one of the couple's 4 children was there too, reportedly still a baby at that point. The sources don't say anything about what that hours-long argument was actually about before the phone camera started recording. It's unclear whether the infidelity accusation Khadijah had posted the day before came up, whether the claims about Jeremy's co-workers were discussed, or whether the fight was about something else entirely that never made it into the public case file. What is known is that by sunrise, the couple still hadn't resolved anything, and the argument didn't die down. It carried straight into the morning. Early on the morning of March 25th, around 7:30 a.m., Jeremy started getting ready for work. According to available accounts, he was trying to leave the apartment specifically to defuse the situation, to step away from the ongoing conflict rather than keep engaging with it. That's the moment Khadijah started a Facebook live stream on her page. Based on surviving copies of the recording, the stream ran for roughly 10 minutes. For part of that time, Khadijah walks around the apartment with the phone in her hand, talking alternately to the camera and to her mother, who's nearby but off screen. At one point, she asks a question that appears to be directed at her mother. Where is his loyalty?
He don't never have to question. He don't want to question everybody's loyalty. But where is his loyalty at?
Throughout this monologue, she repeats the same accusation from her post the day before, that her husband was walking out and leaving her alone with their 4 kids. None of the available materials specify what Khadija's mother said in response to that question, or whether she responded at all. In this part of the recording, the camera captures more of a monologue from Khadija than a back and forth between the 2 women. Jeremy doesn't appear on camera until later, once he's getting ready to leave. The shift from that monologue to a direct confrontation with her husband happens with no real pause in the recording. Khadija keeps talking, her tone unchanged, and at some point she's no longer speaking to her mother, but directly to Jeremy, who by then is getting dressed and holding his phone, apparently about to call someone on his way to work. The recording doesn't answer whether he even realized his wife was live streaming, or whether it had been obvious to him from the start of the argument. The footage shows a man getting dressed with a phone near his ear, and a woman who keeps pushing the confrontation while he's preparing to walk out the door. Khadija asks the same question over and over. What is the conversation you want to have?
Look at that. Sad case as a father. Okay, Jeremy, what is the conversation you want to have?
Jeremy tells her he's not trying to argue. I ain't even trying to argue at all. I'm just trying to get out. At one point, he says something that would go on to become one of the key pieces of evidence in the case.
I'm still asking what is the conversation.
Do not touch me. Tell your daughter to keep her hands off me. According to some of the material that circulated along with the recording, that same line appears in a longer version. Don't touch me. I'll call the police over that. What stands out is Jeremy's tone throughout. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't fire back with counter-accusations. He repeats some version of the same thing several times. That he doesn't want to fight, that he's just trying to get out of the apartment. Khadija, based on the recording, doesn't let up and keeps asking the same question, not letting the conversation end. A second woman's voice is also audible on the recording.
But like I said, don't keep putting me in situations that's not my problem. And then, like I said, this is your family.
Based on the available material, she jumps into the argument, saying something to the effect that this is his family and that he should be there, helping, taking care of the kids, a line delivered right as Jeremy is trying to leave. There's no way to pin down exactly when in the conversation this was said, or how Jeremy reacted to it, based on what's publicly available. Separate material that circulated alongside the stream recording suggests the conflict crossed into physical violence at some point. According to that material, Khadija hit Jeremy and threatened to kill him. That detail doesn't appear in any official statement from investigators and can't be treated as confirmed by the evidence the prosecution actually presented. We're including it only because it circulated alongside the recording, nothing more. According to investigators, at some point the gun ended up pointed at Jeremy. What led up to that moment, whether Khadija pulled the gun out suddenly, whether she'd been holding it since the start of the argument, or where the weapon even came from in a room where her husband was trying to leave for work, isn't disclosed in the sources. This is one of the details that stays literally out of frame. At this point in the stream, the camera isn't pointed at what's happening between the couple. It's pointed at the ceiling of the apartment. According to some accounts, the picture actually goes dark completely at this point, leaving only audio. The recording contains no visual of the shot itself. How many people were watching that stream live in the moment the shot rang out isn't something the sources report. What is known is that the recording made its way into the hands of other users who saved and reshared it, which is the only reason it survived at all, since the original live stream page later became inaccessible. Some of those random viewers literally heard the moment Jeremy Brown died before the deputies who responded to the scene did. A single shot rings out. The sound is clear, even though the camera doesn't show what's happening in the room. Right after the shot, 2 women can be heard screaming on the stream. Then, a child crying. One voice calls for help. According to some of the material that circulated, one phrase is audible among the sounds coming from the apartment in those seconds. Your daddy's dead, apparently directed at one of Khadija and Jeremy's children, based on the context. After that, the live stream cuts off. What happened in the apartment in the gap between the shot and the call to emergency services is another blank spot in the public case file. How much time passed between the stream cutting off and the call to dispatch? Who actually decided to call? Whether Khadija or her mother tried to help Jeremy before medics arrived, None of that is documented in the sources. What is known is that the gap between those 2 points, the end of the live stream and the call to dispatch, appears to have been a matter of minutes. Lowndes County Dispatch received a call about a domestic violence incident between 7:40 and 7:42 a.m. Lowndes County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, by all accounts, within minutes of the call. Jeremy Rashad Brown was found dead in his own apartment. He died from a single gunshot wound. He was pronounced dead at the scene. At the scene, deputies recovered a 9mm handgun and a spent shell casing. On the morning of March 25, 2023, a man who, 20 days earlier, had publicly called his wife a queen, was killed by a single bullet in his own apartment, while the conflict inside his household streamed live to strangers on social media. In that same apartment, 4 children were left behind, having just heard, through a closed door, the sound that split their family in two. Khadijah Michelle Brown didn't run. Unlike a lot of cases like this, where a suspect tries to leave the scene before police arrive, that didn't happen here. She was still in the apartment on Green Tree Drive by the time Lowndes County Sheriff's deputies got there. Based on available material, her arrest happened either right there on scene or within minutes of officers arriving. The public record doesn't show any gap in between where Khadijah might have tried to flee or resist. The arrest procedure itself, in cases like this, usually follows the standard protocol for calls involving a firearm discharged inside a residence. Deputies first secure the scene, determine whether anyone present is still armed, separate witnesses from the suspect to prevent stories from being coordinated, and only then move to a formal arrest. The public record doesn't confirm each of those specific steps in this particular case, but the fact that Khadijah was taken into custody without incident points to an arrest that went smoothly, with no attempt to run. Khadijah Brown was taken to the Lowndes County Adult Detention Center. What followed, booking, fingerprinting, the paperwork that comes with being processed into custody, is standard procedure in any Mississippi county. She was charged with murder, the most serious charge available at that stage of the investigation, before the case would eventually go before the county's grand jury. While Khadijah sat in custody, deputies were still working the scene, where they had already recovered the 9mm handgun and the shell casing, items that immediately became physical evidence. A separate order was issued for an autopsy on Jeremy Brown's body. That part of the investigation was handled by Lowndes County Coroner Greg Merchant, whose role in cases like this is to officially determine the cause and manner of death. In other words, to confirm that death resulted from the gunshot wound documented at the scene, and not from some other cause. The results of that autopsy were never published in any available source. The first public voice on this case belonged to Lowndes County Sheriff Eddie Hawkins. He issued an official statement confirming the key facts of what happened and immediately framed the context that mattered for understanding this family's story. There was a history of domestic violence between Brown and the victim. This was a tragic and senseless murder, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the family of the victim. Fortunately, Brown is in custody, and we look forward to the criminal justice system holding her accountable. That statement carries a few layers worth unpacking. On one hand, Sheriff Hawkins publicly labeled what happened from the very start as a murder, not self-defense, not an accident, and called it tragic and senseless. On the other hand, he deliberately put the couple's prior history of domestic violence into the public record right away, which immediately set the frame for how this case would be understood. Not as an isolated flash of violence between two people with no prior conflict, but as the culmination of a pattern that already existed. As for Jeremy Brown's family, their reaction to losing a son, a brother, and the father of 4 children isn't documented anywhere in the public record. Not in direct quotes, not in interviews, in those first hours and days. On Khadijah Brown's side, during that same window, the first few days after her arrest, no public statements are on record either. Khadijah's mother, who was in the apartment when the shot was fired and appears to have been one of the only witnesses to what happened, hasn't left behind a single documented public comment about what she saw. Immediately after her arrest, Khadijah Michelle Brown was held without bail. That kind of strict measure is typical in the early stages of murder cases. Courts generally don't take up the question of release until after the first formal hearing, once there's at least a preliminary sense of how serious the charge is.
Is set at $750,000. Coroner Greg Merchant says an autopsy is scheduled for Jeremy Brown.
A few days after her arrest, the Lowndes County Justice Court did set bail at $750,000. A figure that size says something on its own. For comparison, bail in murder cases in counties with similar demographics and crime rates rarely tops a few $100,000, and the amount set here effectively ruled out any chance of Khadijah getting out before trial, unless her family could come up with money on the scale of a small house. Whether that bail was ever posted, and whether Khadijah spent any part of the 14 months before trial outside the detention center isn't specified in the sources, though the size of the bail makes that scenario unlikely. Over the following months, the case moved through Lowndes County's usual process, gathering evidence, preparing materials to send to the state grand jury. The public record has almost nothing to say about what happened during that stretch. No interim hearings are on record, no public statements from either side, no leaks about what came up in interviews. This is one of those stretches in the case timeline that stays almost entirely out of public view, which is standard for the pre-trial stage, when prosecution and defense are building their positions without disclosing them ahead of a formal indictment. In August 2023, roughly 5 months after the murder, a Mississippi state grand jury handed down an indictment against Khadijah Brown on a murder charge. At that point, no trial date had been set yet. A grand jury indictment isn't a verdict or an admission of guilt. It's a formal confirmation that there's enough evidence to send the case to trial. On its own, this stage simply meant the case had officially moved from investigation into the trial phase. It said nothing about how it would ultimately turn out. The key piece of evidence in the case was the Facebook Live recording itself. Even though the camera was pointed at the ceiling at the decisive moment, the audio track captured the course of the argument, the shot itself, and the reaction of everyone in the room right after. Additional evidence included the 9mm handgun and shell casing recovered at the scene. Together, these materials formed the evidentiary basis prosecutors brought to the table in plea negotiations. Negotiations the public record doesn't detail in terms of content or process. Almost a year after the indictment, on May 24, 2024, Khadijah Michelle Brown appeared before a judge in Lowndes County Circuit Court. By this point, she turned 29. At the hearing, she pleaded guilty, not to first-degree murder, as the original charge had been framed, but to second-degree murder. That's a legally lesser charge, one that generally implies the absence of proven premeditation, though it doesn't rule out that the act which caused death was a conscious one. At that same hearing, Khadijah stated that the shot that killed her husband had been an accident. The public record doesn't give any direct detail on exactly how she described the circumstances of the shooting to the judge, whether any of Jeremy Brown's family members were present at the May 24th hearing, and whether any of them delivered what's known as a victim impact statement. A standard practice in American courts during sentencing for murder cases isn't something the public record addresses. The judge handling the case sentenced Khadijah Brown to 40 years in prison. Of that sentence, she'll serve 34 years behind bars. The remaining 6 years will be served under supervised release once she's out. The hearing where the sentence was handed down took place on a Friday. The guilty plea process itself, under Mississippi's court standards, requires the defendant to go through several formal steps before a final sentence is handed down. The judge has to confirm the plea was made voluntarily, without pressure from either the prosecution or the defense, and that the defendant understands the consequences of her decision and is knowingly giving up her right to a jury trial. Pleading guilty in exchange for a lesser charge is common practice in the American court system, letting both sides avoid the uncertainty that comes with a jury trial. For the prosecution, it guarantees a conviction without the risk of an acquittal. For the defense, it means a known, and typically shorter, sentence compared to the maximum possible penalty for first-degree murder. Legally, a deal like this isn't the same as establishing the truth the way an adversarial jury trial would. Both sides are agreeing on a charge that works for them, not necessarily the one that most accurately describes what actually happened. By the end of May 2024, the case was formally closed. The defendant convicted, sentenced, the term set. Today, Khadijah Michelle Brown is serving her sentence in the Mississippi prison system. She won't be eligible for supervised release for at least 34 years. That means a woman who was 29 years old at sentencing will spend most of the rest of her adult life behind bars and won't walk free again until she's well into old age, decades after her youngest child turns 18. By the time she's eligible for release, all 4 of her children, Jeremiah, Zania, Messiah, and Josiah, will have grown up, become adults, possibly started families of their own, having gone through nearly their entire conscious lives without seeing their mother outside prison walls. Jeremy Rashad Brown was buried on April 8, 2023. His visitation was held the day before, on April 7th, from 2 to 6 p.m. at Carter's Funeral Services on 14th Street in Columbus. His funeral service took place the next day at Friendship MB Church, the same congregation he'd belonged to since he was young, led by Reverend Stanley McCreary. He was buried that same day at Union Cemetery. Neither his obituary nor any of the material surrounding the funeral includes a single direct quote from a family member about how they remembered Jeremy, just a plain list of survivors and the ceremony details. That doesn't mean the grief around his death wasn't public. The funeral home's online guestbook exists specifically so friends and acquaintances can leave their own memories, but the sources don't disclose what, if anything, was written there. The case drew attention from dozens of TV stations and news outlets across the country, from Mississippi to California, and that attention didn't stop after just a few days. Local Mississippi TV stations were the first to report on it, and their coverage became the basis for most of what followed, including Sheriff Hawkins' statement, which was picked up and repeated nearly word for word by dozens of regional and national outlets. From there, outlets aiming at a broader audience picked up the story too. Tabloid-style sites, for whom the phrase "murdered on livestream" was already a ready-made headline, as well as more specialized outlets that publish true crime content for a dedicated fan audience. Worth adding to that is a quieter but steady stream of content on platforms like TikTok, where, up until fairly recently, users kept posting videos recapping the case, breaking down the recording, and offering their own theories about what happened. Amid all the uncertainty surrounding the motive, the legal classification of the crime, and what's become of the people this story left behind, one thing can be said with confidence. Jeremy Rashad Brown was a real person, a son, a brother, a churchgoer, a father of 4, not a character in a story that gets reshared on social media for views. His family and his church community buried him the way you bury someone you love, with a visitation, a service, a burial next to family members who'd already passed. Nothing that happened that morning of March 25th was something he deserved, and his 4 children certainly didn't deserve it either. The same 4 kids who, in that same house, on that same morning, lost both parents at once. One forever, the other for decades. While millions of views piled up under other people's retellings of this story, the real Jeremiah, Zanya, Messiah, and Josiah were growing up without a father and without a mother, somewhere off camera, a camera that hopefully will never be part of their lives again. Of all the questions this story leaves behind, there's one final question no court anywhere can answer. What happens to a child who grows up knowing their mother killed their father and that it happened live, on a stream that anyone who goes looking for it can still find?